Hello, welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about the ideological stronghold of woke again. Today we're going to be talking about post woke, so it's going to be very related to what we talked about last week. So if you haven't seen that one, I highly recommend going back and checking that one out. For each ideological stronghold that we have checked out so far, for example, materialism, nihilism, or woke, it's possible to find God after rejecting that individual stronghold, or it's possible to have people go into different ideological strongholds, mix and match, and just kind of develop into either going back to God or falling back into another system. But we always seem to have a cyclical manner to this. We have people rejecting materialism, falling into nihilism, and then going into something like woke or post woke. Now, what does it mean for people to reject woke? And what does it necessarily look like? We find ourselves in a society where all of the traditions have been questioned. Many of the guardrails have been removed or replaced. Particularly for young people, they might reject woke, but they still experience the fruit of its labor. They have found themselves in a society at war with its own contradictions, and something else must fill in the gap in order to make sense of the world. Many people who reject woke often accept faith and accept God and come back to Him. Others yet would reject woke and on the grounds that it didn't go far enough. But our focus today will be on neither of those groups, but all of the people who have been left in the middle. There is a reason why I'm calling this ideological stronghold post woke. In simple terms, I'm calling it that because people don't like the results of woke, but they still believe in the structure of it. There are many examples of this, both great and small, and many of them are considered reactionary in how they react to woke. This means a lot of movements fall under this umbrella, but they all have similar outcomes and beliefs. I'll cover some of them very briefly to illustrate what I'm talking about. The first being Christian nationalism, which is neither Christian nor nationalist. Now, I've not met anyone who is actually Christian nationalist except for in online spaces, which is somewhat typical of many of the movements that fall under this umbrella. Christian nationalism presents itself as the political means to overthrow woke. There is a legitimate concern about the effects that woke has on our society, and this movement answers a lot of those concerns. But the overthrow of woke ideology cannot be done through the restoration of constitutional and biblical principles. Everything must be torn down and rebuilt. Does that sound familiar at all? This is the same inclination as those who want destruction, and it is not a biblical viewpoint. Rather, it's assessing the situation through the lens of power and oppression, placing themselves as the marginalized group so that we further destroy the foundations of society in order to build it back up. This is reflective of that same exact ideology that they want to protect against. Another movement that we could talk about is everything that's under the banner of Red Pill, which is so on the nose for what we were talking about with the Matrix. I personally will not use the terms red pill or blue pill in regards to any of my personal beliefs, and I'll talk about that more in a couple of weeks as to why. But I believe that this calls for discernment whenever we hear people using this language. Because not all people who say, hey, well, they're going to red pill somebody on something, not all of it is nefarious necessarily. What is it that they are claiming to know? Why is it distinct from regular wisdom and understanding? And are people buying into this false consciousness because they claim to understand something that regular people don't? These movements are fairly popular among young people, and that is my greatest concern. Many young people have fallen into it because they believe woke ideology to be untrue, yet they buy into this because their critique of woke appears to be true. The largest and most recognized red pill movement out there is the one about men's rights. Just as with Christian nationalism, there are political and spiritual questions that should be asked about masculinity and manhood, and all of that is totally legitimate. However, the primary aim of this movement is not to restore truth. Instead of bringing back the values of what masculinity is, they prefer the caricature of the critique. They want what they believe has been stolen from them, the stereotypical 1950s male and all of the debauchery and irresponsibility of chauvinism. Men such as Andrew Tate exemplify this, and many young people are trapped into believing that he knows what is best for them. Because they are willing to fight the dominant counterculture, they are able to gain the trust of so many young people and backfill all of their desires and wish fulfillments. This is important to see how many of these movements like this operate. They have placed themselves, even though they are men, as the victims within the society, and because of that, they are now the marginalized group, and the ends justify the means. Their view of God and morality are diminished. The way that they view women is diminished. The way that they handle themselves is diminished, all because they want that wish fulfillment. At this point, we're going to shift away from talking about these specific movements and more about the framework itself. First, these movements are all alternative or superior ways of knowing. We see this particularly with all the smaller movements, but it scales into even woke itself. They are the ones to claim to know how things really are. These are all how these false consciousness movements work. They must offer something fantastical or greater as to put themselves among experts, masters, the priesthood, royalty, or even as the Savior himself. To offer the red pill means that you hold specialized knowledge and better wisdom than the critique knowledge and wisdom, which will always run counter to conventional wisdom. It's the audacity to believe that you know better and far more than everyone else around you, which is the exact opposite of what humility and wisdom is. For an example of this, conventional wisdom says that gravity applies in all situations, and that you don't need to experience jumping off a tall building to understand gravity. A critique of this wisdom would say that they haven't seen anyone jump off of that particular building, and that there is only one way to find out. It might seem like a silly example, but we have seen how these movements will critique and tear society apart, removing all barriers and guardrails with no disregard in how it will affect the society. This allows for the backfilling of their own doctrine and beliefs in order to critique the status quo. It also goes back to everything being about power and dominance. When it comes to these ideologies, their existence in opposition to one another helps affirm their beliefs. For example, red pill ideology confirms the existence of a patriarchal structure. Christian nationalism is a confirmation of a superstructure that wishes to oppress. Woke activism is cause to tear the entire system down. This aids those who believe in a false consciousness to be further entrenched into it. The threat seems real, and now they have a justification for their belief. This creates more fighting and more commitment to these strongholds, destabilizing and demoralizing society. Post-woke also has the same inversion of values, but instead of reverting back to a time pre-woke where all the systems were in place, the people who are post-woke now decide what the value system should be, so it is still a critique of what has come before. It's not placing a new fence up, it's a caricature of what the fence used to be. This isn't people seeking truth. People are presupposing their own folly to be wisdom. It is still the weaponized relativism present. It is simply coming from a different perspective. What is left here is the attempted destruction of what is right versus wrong. We read in Isaiah 5, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who consider themselves wise and judge themselves clever. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine, who are champions at pouring beer, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of justice." Now, we have established that woke and post-woke movements are using the same framework, but at its root, is this framework in the history of the church at all? And I've seen multiple people draw the comparison between these movements and Gnosticism, and there are plenty of parallels. I plan on coming back to this far in the future when I can give this topic its own series because of all the research that I did, and I can give a lot more context to this. But the more I did a lot of research on this, the more I saw Gnosticism in woke. As defined by Merriam-Webster, Gnosticism is the thought and practice, especially of various cults in late pre-Christian and early Christian centuries, disguised by the conviction that matter is evil and that emancipation comes through gnosis. We can define gnosis as esoteric or mystical knowledge. At its root, then, it's the knowledge that we are imprisoned and that understanding the hidden knowledge frees people as spiritual beings. In short, many of the same criticisms that we had of woke and post-woke seem to stem from the same root as gnosis. But there is one aspect of gnosis that I really want to look at before moving on, and it is the idea of the demiurge. The demiurge is defined within Gnosticism as the architect subordinate god that constructs the world. The Christian Gnostics, for example, claimed that God in the Old Testament was this architect of the universe, and fair enough, right? But in the Gnostic tradition, he's not a benevolent God, but a malevolent God, as he created the universe that traps us in our being. And a few things stem from this. First, this is the same root cause as understanding the world in such a way that it must be torn down. By necessity, a belief in this God means that we must rewrite the social contract, invert the values, and destroy the present reality, drawing the same parallel as to what we have been talking about over the past 2 weeks. But most importantly, and why I believe it's so important to mention Gnosticism and demiurge in this video, is that by this belief structure, by its very nature, we're trying to place the self in the role of God. To take down the demiurge is to place yourself as the demiurge, which makes you both the architect and the tyrant. And this is exactly what we see these movements doing. Again, I want to give a lot more time to this in the future, but I'll leave it at that because this is going to illustrate how these ideas are neither new or rational, but rather they are old and heretical. Has false consciousness movements made its way into the church? I would say undoubtedly yes, and we're going to talk a bit about progressive Christianity here. I think it's more than just a movement that is permissive in nature, which it is. I also think that it is more than just an appeasement to the culture, which it is. I think it is to place the self in the God-shaped whole yet again. Here's my reasoning for this. When we could throw out the Old Testament because it's no longer relevant, when we could avoid reading Romans 1 in its full context only to quote Romans 2, when proper interpretation and understanding no longer matter, when we can hold the authority but not give God the final word, and when we lean only on our own understanding, how could we even claim to not be overthrowing God? Undoubtedly, we have a problem in the Western Church, and we must be vigilant and discerning in order to recognize it for what it is. The world's knowledge being repackaged as biblical truth. Before we leave, I want to talk about our second story from Genesis, which is Sodom. Many of us know the story really well by this point, so I'm not going to read the entire thing. But I think it's important to note how similar our culture is to Sodom, and where people have become proud of their sin and debauchery, and where there is also an inversion of values. While this might seem like an overall negative message, there's also a message of hope here to be found when Abraham was speaking to the Lord in Genesis 18. Abraham stepped forward and said, "Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away instead of sparing the place for the sake of 50 righteous people who are in it? You could not possibly do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. You could not possibly do that. Won't the judge of the whole earth do what is just?" The Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." At this point, there's a back and forth here until finally the Lord and Abraham talk down to 10 individuals within our society. And I think that this is such an incredible verse because it is talking about that intercessory prayer between us and God. It's talking about even in the midst of all of the wickedness around, that even a few good men, God will not destroy the surrounding country, and he will not surround the city and destroy it for their sake. At the beginning of the introduction of this series, we talked about how these ideological strongholds could be demoralizing. And I have certainly felt that over the last couple of weeks when I was really diving deep into this. But we really see ourselves in this culture, in the same culture as Saddam, where there's an inversion of values, where they celebrate their own wickedness in the streets. However, we have a God that is in charge, and he knows us. He knows what's in our hearts, and he knows that we remain faithful to him. It's so easy for us to fall into this disillusionment over the fact that our society is in a free fall, and we must never forget who we are as children of God. We must first seek the kingdom, and we can even see him working in the midst of our demoralized society. We can pray and intercede for our nation against these ideological strongholds. We can protect our communities, we can protect our families, and we can protect ourselves from these strongholds. Eventually, our society may succumb to sin. However, there are many of us who believe out there. My hope is in the fact that we can overcome these challenges through prayer and understanding. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to change gears very slightly. We've been talking about ideological strongholds outside of the church, but now we're going to start talking about demoralization from within the church. And until next time, God bless and stay salty.